Back in 1994, an 11-year-old named Mark was living just outside of Philadelphia with his family. And for the past few summers, he and his siblings would go up to this summer camp on Mount Kitney in a rural part of New Jersey, and they would stay there for about 8 weeks every summer. And this year would be no different, so on June 23rd, Mark and his siblings and his family loaded up the minivan and they began their 2.5-hour commute up to Mount Kitney. When they arrived, the parking lot is filled with parents dropping off their kids, and there's already a batch of campers that had arrived already that are coming down to meet the new campers. And in the middle of all of this chaos, one of Mark's friends from the previous summer, his name was Kyle, he was the same age as Mark, he saw Mark and he runs down and he excitedly tells Mark that they had been placed in the same cabin this year. And so Mark is thrilled, the summer is already off to a great start. So for the next hour or so, Mark and his siblings and Kyle, they began moving all of their stuff up to the cabins. And then at some point, all the parents left and all the campers were instructed to head over to the big dining hall where the camp director and some of the camp counselors were going to go over expectations and scheduling over the next few days. So Mark and Kyle make their way over to the dining hall. They sit down at one of the long tables next to a couple of their buddies, and they listen in while the director goes over the rules and the regulations. And the director would make a special point, like they do every year, to remind all the campers that the faraway dock is absolutely off limits. So don't ask about it, don't try to swim out to it, just leave it alone. The main cluster of buildings that made up the camp was situated right up against this huge man-made lake that was quite long and fairly narrow, and on one side of this lake was the designated swimming area, and then this side they didn't even use for the camp. And within the swimming section, there was a main dock that extended fairly far out into the water that they divided. On one side was the weaker swimmers, and on the other side of the dock was the more advanced swimmers. And then farther out past the dock were these two floating docks, these square floating docks. There was one that was maybe about 10 meters away from the head of the main dock. And then there was the so-called faraway dock that was absurdly far away. In fact, no one really knew why it was out there to begin with. It was at least 100 meters away from the head of the main dock. There were lots of conspiracy theories about why the faraway dock was actually off limits, because the camp staff never actually explicitly said what their reasoning was for not allowing anyone to go near it. They just said it was very dangerous. Most campers believed it was just because the faraway dock was so far away. It was a dangerous swim to be making, even for an experienced swimmer. Other campers had heard a rumor that years earlier, someone had swam out and then gotten sucked underneath. There was apparently some suction underneath this dock, and they got sucked underneath and they drowned. And then the most outlandish conspiracy theory was the dock was not actually a dock at all. It was a lid that was covering over a secret tunnel that went into the lake. But regardless of whichever conspiracy theory the campers believed in, the faraway dock had developed a very spooky reputation, and they did not need to be told twice to not go near it. No one's going near it. Well, unless you're Kyle. After the director and some of the counselors had gone up and spoken, the campers were allowed to finish their meal and then make their way back to their cabins. So Mark and Kyle finish their meal and they start walking back. They go into their cabin. They're getting set up in their bed. Their two other cabin mates come in and they're all kind of chatting and joking around. And at some point they turn off the lights and they want to go to bed. And after a little while, after the lights have been turned off in the cabin and everyone's trying to sleep, Kyle breaks the silence by saying, "Hey guys, I really want to swim out to the faraway dock this summer." Now, Mark and the other two that were in there with Kyle had heard Kyle say this before. He talked incessantly the summer before about wanting to swim out to the faraway dock, but he never did, and he really never showed any serious attempt at wanting to go out there. And so when he's saying this now, they're not taking him seriously at all. And so they kind of laughed and said, "Yeah, it's pretty creepy, that dock out there. I wonder why we can't go out there." And they kind of had a quick discussion about, the various hot theories around why you can't go out there. And ultimately, they just kind of wrote it off and went to sleep. The next morning, Mark and Kyle got up and began their walk over to the dining hall to get some breakfast. And on the walk, Kyle says to Mark, "Hey, I want to swim out to the faraway dock today at lunch. Will you come with me?" And so to this point, Mark has only ever heard Kyle talk about the faraway dock and going to it in theory. There's never been a timestamp of this is when we're going to do it. And all of a sudden, Mark's thinking, Kyle might be serious. He might actually want to do this. And so Mark looks at Kyle and he's like, "Are you sure that's a good idea? Because I know there's lots of theories about why we can't go out there, but it's pretty clear the camp counselor and the director believe it's a dangerous place." And Kyle just kind of smirks and he's like, I don't believe that. My dad told me that dock is probably just rotting and that's why they don't want us to be on it. And so I think as long as we're not jumping on it and we stay towards the edge of the dock on the main beams, we should be fine. At this point, Mark wants to convince Kyle not to do it. So he takes another approach. And he goes, well, Kyle, what about the swim out there? I mean, that's a difficult swim and, you're not the best swimmer. So how do you feel about that? And Kyle shrugs and he's like, we'll just take some pool noodles and we'll take our time going out there. And hey, if I start drowning, you can just rescue me. Mark started to get the sense that this was going to happen whether he participated or not. And Mark's thinking to himself, if he goes and he's successful at getting out to the faraway dock and I basically back out because I'm too scared to go, I'm going to have a whole summer of living that down and spending all my time with this guy who's going to rub it in my face. And so Mark didn't know what else to say to Kyle and he just says, all right, if you go, I'll go with you. So Mark and Kyle go in, they have their breakfast, and then afterwards they split up because they each had different activities that morning. And so they don't see each other for a couple of hours. And then it comes to be lunchtime, and Mark knows this is the time they were going to swim out to the faraway dock. And he's hoping as he's walking towards the dining hall that somehow Kyle's forgotten or has changed his mind. And as he gets right in front of the dining hall, he hears Kyle yell his name, and he looks to the side of the building. There's this big forest right next to the dining hall, and he sees Kyle, and he's got his bathing suit on and his pool noodle in hand. He's got an extra one as well. And next to Kyle are his two other cabin mates, who also have bathing suits on and are also holding pool noodles. Mark's pretty disappointed at this point because now it's really happening. He had put on his bathing suit, so, he's ready. And he walks over to Kyle and his other two cabin mates. And the whole time he's kind of hoping that a camp counselor or one of the directors will see him and will question them and stop them from doing what they're about to do. And so he's kind of taking his time, looking over his shoulder, trying to be extra suspicious as he walks across this field. Like, look at me, I'm doing something bad. I hope no one catches me. And he makes it to the tree line and no one catches him. And Kyle hands him his pool noodle. And then Kyle and the other two cabin mates turn and start kind of walking/running into the woods, and Mark follows after them. And as they're running, Kyle turns around and tells Mark that their cabin mates didn't want to be left out, and that's why they're here. And Mark had a sinking feeling that probably they had the same reaction that he did, which is, if I don't do this with him, he's going to rub this in my face for the whole summer and I'm living with him. And I'd rather just swim to this horrible dock than put up with that for the whole summer. And so they finally make it to the swimming area and they have their main dock that juts out into the water. And then there's the closer floating dock. And then way over there is the faraway dock. And as soon as they get onto the beach, they're kind of exposed. And the main camp, if they were down at the water's edge, they could look and see them if they were looking in that direction. And so the boys immediately get into the water and they put themselves up against the main dock, kind of obscuring them from view from anybody that's over at the main side of camp. And they begin swimming out to the faraway dock. The swim out was super easy. It's beautiful outside, it's sunny, the water feels great. They had their pool noodles to rest on, so not much energy to actually do the swim itself. And they were taking their time because they had at least about an hour and a half to 2 hours before they'd need to be back at camp before someone recognized they were gone. And so they get about 3/4 of the way out to the faraway dock, and it's the first time they can see it more or less up close. Because before this, none of them had been to the faraway dock and had never been close to the faraway dock. So this is the first time they're really getting a good look at it. And the dock is pretty unremarkable. It looks a little bit more beat up than the other dock. The wood is more gray, and it looks like there's probably a good amount of splinters on there. But it definitely does not look like it's so rotten that if they climb on it, it's going to collapse under their weight, which makes them happy because now they know they can actually get on it and take a break from swimming for a second. But they were kind of let down. They're nearing this thing it's become almost like folklore within their camp, and it's just kind of a huge letdown that it looks like any other dock. They finally made their way right up to the ladder, which was fairly rusted over, and Mark was actually the first one to be in front of the ladder, and he was about to grab it and step onto it when he stops. And the other three are right behind him, and they're like, "What?" And he goes, "Look at that." And on the ladder is this thick-bodied, wide, fat spider with long legs that's just perched on the rung of the ladder. And so the boys all see the spider and they're like, okay, number one, I'm not touching that ladder. I'm going to be climbing up somewhere else. I'll figure out a way to get on this dock that does not involve this ladder. And two, how did the spider get out here? It's huge. What is it doing out here? Like, where did it come from? There's no land around us. But they're like, you know what? Whatever. There's one random spider on this dock. Can't be a big deal. And so they make their way over to the side, so away from the ladder. And Mark actually grabs onto the edge of the dock, the wood, and manages to pull himself up, and they push him up as he gets up there. And Mark turns around and he hoists up Kyle, and they end up hoisting up the next two. And before long, you have all four on the dock, and they're looking at each other, and they're feeling pretty good about it. Even though it was a letdown that there's not much going on out here besides maybe that weird spider, but it'll make for a great story. And they couldn't wait to get back and tell their friends that they had made it out to the faraway dock. So they weren't ready to just jump right back in the water and go right back to shore. So they laid down on the wooden slats of the dock itself, and they just enjoyed laying in the sun. And as Mark's laying there, he hears a very distinctive scratching sound or rustling sound that's coming from right underneath the floorboards that he's laying on. And the dock itself was resting on these big blue barrels to stay afloat. And so Mark's laying there thinking maybe the barrel is rotating underneath the wood and it's causing a weird sound, or maybe there's some residual waves from us moving around and displacing the water that's, lapping up against the side of the barrels. But Mark at the time was not really overanalyzing this. This is just his initial thoughts of what the sound could be. He's not remotely concerned about what the sound is. He just took stock of it. And at some point, Mark and the other guys stand up because they're kind of bored of just laying there, and they start goofing around and pushing each other and trying to see if they can push each other off of the dock. And then they start playing one of their favorite games that they play on the other floating dock, where they all kind of shimmy to one corner of the dock and try to get that side to begin to submerge without falling off. So the boys shuffle to the corner of the dock, and they're all kind of jokingly jockeying for position, because they're going to flood this side and they don't want to fall off. And so they get in position and the dock starts to sink. And so after about a third of the dock was now underwater, they start hearing a scratching sound like the one Mark had heard when he was laying on his back. And all of a sudden, hundreds of those huge, thick-bodied, long-legged spiders start coming out from underneath the dock through the breaks in the wood. They're pouring out frantically, trying to climb out from underneath the dock because the boys have just flooded their nest. And so hundreds of these things are pouring out from underneath and sliding down towards the boys because it's on an angle, and Kyle in a panic loses his footing and falls face first onto the dock. But because his weight shifted so quickly, the dock went down flat again, and now Kyle's laying on the dock as these spiders are swarming his body, getting in his hair, and Mark and the other two are still on the dock, and they can feel the spiders at their feet, and they jump into the water. And Mark, as soon as he hits the water, he sees there's hundreds of spiders in the water. They're all over the place, and that's when he feels one in his hair, and he's trying to swat it off of his head, and he dives underwater thinking that's going to get rid of it, but no, he feels it grip down tight on his hair, and he had to reach up and actually grab the body of the spider and pull it off of his hair. He swims up, and there's more spiders around him. He frantically starts swimming away, and he hears Kyle screaming, and he sees him jump into the water, still trying to pull spiders off of his body, and then the boys would swim as fast as humanly possible to shore, the whole time either literally pulling spiders out of their hair that were clinging to their hair or their ears, or believing, because they just had this horrible experience, that there are more spiders on them. And so the whole time, they're pulling spiders off even if they aren't there. Like Ricky Bobby in Talladega Nights, he thinks he's on fire when he's not. That's the situation they're in, but with spiders. They finally get to shore, and they're looking each other over to make sure there's no more spiders on them, in their shorts, on their back, in their hair, in their ears. And finally, all the spiders are gone, and they're safe again. Mark said he'll never get over the trauma of this horrifying event. And he says what really gets to him is when he thinks about when he was laying on his back on the dock, and the other three were doing the same thing, and he heard that rustling, that scratching sound. That was the sound of hundreds of these massive spiders that were literally inches away from them, perched underneath the dock. And not just any spider, but the dock spider, and they're named that because they make their home in docks, because they typically hunt for fish, small fish, insects as well, and they have the ability to run on water. They have this waxy substance on their legs that keeps them from sinking, and they can even jump on water and then land again on water to avoid being eaten by fish. And they can go underwater for up to 30 minutes. They can effectively scuba dive because they trap air on their hairy arms and underneath their bellies, and they breathe that while they're underwater. And so these spiders identified the faraway dock as a great spot to live, and they must have ran out on the water to this dock and then made a home underneath, and then no one's disturbing them, so they flourished. Later on, Mark would find out from one of the camp counselors that the real reason the faraway dock was off limits, the reason that they didn't want anyone going out there, is because they discovered the faraway dock was a breeding ground for these dock spiders. And they tried to get rid of them, but they kept coming back. And so after a number of failed attempts, they finally just gave the faraway duck to the dock spiders. And the reason they don't tell the campers about it is because they don't want to scare them. Our next story is called Tripwire. In 2015, an experienced outdoorsman named Bob, along with his wife, his young daughter, and their 2 German shepherds, decided to go camping in a remote part of northern Oregon. When they arrived at the site, Bob began setting up the big family tent for everyone to sleep in, and his daughter said, "Hey, do you mind if I sleep in the spare 2-man tent that we always bring with us?" Bob and his wife deliberated for a minute, but said, "You know what, that's fine, but you gotta bring Guts." That's one of the German shepherds. Guts needs to sleep with you because he's gonna be your protection. So that night, after some s'mores around a campfire, Bob's daughter, along with Guts, retreat to their 2-man tent, and Bob, his wife, and Leah, the other dog, retreat to their tent. That night, Bob wakes up suddenly to what sounds like footsteps outside of his tent, and he looks to his side, and his wife is still in the tent with him, and so is Leah, the other dog, and he listens really closely, and he can hear his daughter is snoring, and he can hear the sound of Guts breathing. So his whole family is accounted for, but he still hears these footsteps, and they don't sound like light little scampering sounds like you might expect from a squirrel or some small critter. They sound heavy, like a big creature is roaming around their campsite. But Bob's dogs are really keyed in to protecting their family, and since Guts and Leah are not up going crazy about whatever's out there, he figures, you know what, it's gotta be an elk or something, and it's not gonna do anything to us, so Bob ultimately just goes back to sleep. The next morning, Bob gets up and everybody's just fine. There's no sign of any intruders in their campsite. And so that only confirms to him that, yep, it was just some harmless animal kind of walking around the wilderness, because we're in a pretty remote area. That morning, they decide to go for a walk down the road that was right next to their campsite. And so they take the dogs, they start walking, and they make it a couple hundred feet down this road when all of a sudden Guts sees something or hears something and takes off sprinting down the road and turns down this little access road that branches off of the road they're on into the woods. And Bob is thinking, oh no, there's a campsite down there and this big German shepherd's gonna bound up on them and something bad's gonna happen. And so Bob, his heart's racing, he starts taking off after Guts. He goes down the access road and he finds Guts stopped right outside of a campsite. But there doesn't appear to be anybody in the campsite. But there's a tent, there's a cooler, there's a table, there's all the things you would expect at a campsite, just no people. So Bob runs up and he grabs Guts and he yells out reflexively, "Hey, I'm really sorry, he's totally harmless. I don't know what he saw. Hey, we're leaving." But then before he leaves, he realizes on the tent, there's this big scratch through it, like it's been cut open. And curiosity gets the better of him. And so he kind of walks up, keeping an eye out in case he's wrong and there are people still here. But as he gets closer, he realizes there's definitely no one here. This site is abandoned. Because he's looking around and all of their stuff has just been ransacked. There's scratch marks on everything, like animals have clearly come through here. And Bob, who is an avid outdoorsman, he knows how much some of their equipment cost. And he's thinking, why would anyone abandon this really expensive tent or this really expensive cooler? And as he's thinking about that, he turns and he sees there's a propane tank, a solid metal propane tank that has been completely flattened. But there's no tree that's fallen nearby. There's no source. There's no way that could have been flattened. So he's definitely unsettled by this, but ultimately he decides, you know what? I'm going to take my family, go back to my campsite. I'll just call the park rangers. They can come down here and they can figure out what this is. Later that afternoon, Bob and his family are back at their campsite just a couple hundred feet away from this abandoned campsite. And at one point, his wife gets up to go use the bathroom. She walks about 70 feet away behind a tree and she squats down, and then all of a sudden she gets up and starts running back towards camp. And Bob sees this. He turns and sees her running towards him. At the same time, Guts gets up and starts sprinting towards her. And so Bob's thinking, what the heck is going on? Bob turns to his daughter and says, stay right here with Leah. And Bob gets up and starts running towards his wife. And Guts at this point has run to his wife and past his wife. Guts has run way into the woods. And as Bob is running up to his wife, he's like, what's going on? Why are you running? What's going on? And she says, I don't know. I just had this horrible feeling someone was watching me. And when I turned, I already saw Guts running towards me and it scared me. And so that's why I'm here. And he's like, look, go with our daughter and with Leah. I'm going to see what's going on. And so his wife leaves and Bob draws his pistol and he starts walking out towards where Guts has now stopped. Hair raised, growling, it's yapping and barking at something in front of it, and Bob's looking and he can't see anything. And finally, after not being able to figure out what the heck is going on, he just takes Guts and goes back to his campsite. When Bob got back to his campsite, he wanted to leave, and his wife wanted to leave. His daughter didn't really know what was going on, but the attitude was, we want to leave. However, it was getting late and they had a bunch of stuff they would need to pack up, and it was going to be a real ordeal trying to do that, especially without any light. So they decide, okay, we'll stay one more day and we're going to leave first thing in the morning. In Bob's head, he's thinking, okay, I heard weird footsteps outside. We have this abandoned campsite nearby that's been thrashed up in the flattened propane tank. And now my wife is running away from something, and Guts is seeing strange things in the woods. Like, there's a lot of weird stuff going on. And he decides he's going to set up a tripwire all the way around his campsite using a rope tied at about 8 inches off the ground, where along the rope would be little pieces of metal that would clang together. So if anything touched the rope, it would make the metallic clinking sound. Then it would alert Bob that someone's here. And so Bob goes over to the edge of the site where there's an obvious starting point for this tripwire, and he bends down to tie the rope, and he realizes, oh my God, someone's already done this. There is another tripwire that's already been built around the outside of our campsite. It's just been cut, it's been broken. Like, it doesn't work, but it's here. Someone else who was at this campsite felt concerned enough about whatever was in the woods that they already had this idea. Bob didn't even tie his perimeter. He just drew his gun, told his family, get in the truck, and he stayed up all night protecting his family in the truck. As soon as the sun came up, they packed up and they got the heck out of there. Bob is convinced that there is something out there in the woods in northern Oregon that was walking around their campsite at night, that's scaring their dogs, that's stalking them basically and watching them from a distance. And probably whatever is out in the woods is the same thing that caused the previous group to set up their own tripwire. And it's also probably the reason the other campers at the other campsite were willing to abandon their nice equipment to get the heck out of there, because they are not messing with whatever the heck is out in those woods.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Laughter.
In the early 2000s, a teenager named Eben and his father would regularly go hunting in the Georgia backcountry. When Eben turned 14, his father befriended a very wealthy landowner in Georgia who offered them access to one of his best private hunting areas. And just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Eben and his father would take him up on the offer. They woke up super early and they drove out to the edge of this property that was actually fenced in. And they went to a main gate where they had the combo that this guy had given them. They punched in the combo, opened up the gate, drove in, shut the gate, locked it, and then continued down the access road. They followed this road for about 2 miles where it came to a stop right outside of this huge forest. They parked their truck, they got out, they put on their gear, and in the pre-morning darkness began hiking into the woods. Even though they were there primarily to hunt, Eben and his father secretly enjoyed just hiking around the woods and camping out, and any chance they got to extend their hunting trips, they would, even if the hunting wasn't good. And so since they spent a ton of time in the woods together, they noticed almost immediately when they walked into this particular forest that something was off. There's no birds, there's no animals, silence. It's just totally silent. The only sounds they heard that were not them was a single plane that passed overhead. Although they found this very odd, they figured, you know what, this is private property, not a lot of people are out here. I'm sure as soon as we showed up, the animals were aware of us and they've scattered. They finally make it out to the hunting stand that the owner had told them about. They get all settled in, they're getting ready to see some animals, and all day long, they don't see a single animal. They don't hear a single animal. In fact, again, it is just completely silent. Frustrated, they began packing up their stuff, making their way down off the stand, and they started looking for a place to make camp for the night. And Eben's father suggested, well, hey, there's obviously nothing over here. It's been quiet all day. Why don't we walk deeper into the woods a little ways, set up camp there, so tomorrow we have a better chance of seeing some animals. So they hiked for about an hour farther away from where they parked their truck, and they reached this clearing, which is perfect for setting up their camp. And so they set up their tent, and Eben's father says, hey, we still got some daylight. Do you want to go try our luck and see if we can see some animals out here now? Eben's like, yeah, why not? So they hike a little ways away from their campsite, and they set up their blind, and once again, they don't see any animals. It's totally quiet. And so they turn around and they start heading back. As soon as they could see their campsite, which really was just their tent, they noticed that their tent was now collapsed. And Eben's father turns to him and says, "Oh, it must have been the wind." And Eben says, "No, it couldn't have been the wind, because all day today we have been commenting on how quiet it is and how the fact that there's no weather, no wind, no anything is heightening the fact that it's completely silent. So it could not have been wind." So Eben's father is like, "Well, when you set the tent up, did you not put the posts into the eyelets? Did you not build it correctly?" And Eben's like, "No, I've made that tent like 1,000 times. I know it was set up correctly." They walk into their campsite and they look down at their tent and they're really confused at what they see. The 2 rods that go in an X over the top of the tent that thread through nylon loops and then anchor at 4 different points on the base of the tent, well, they had been removed from the 4 corners. And if you know how a tent works, it works on tension. And once you have a rod anchored in 2 points, it doesn't just pop out. It's anchored at 2 sides. It's actually difficult to remove each anchor. Once one is out, the other comes out easily. But basically, the rod would need to break in order for it to come out of those anchor points, or someone would have to come over and remove it. And they didn't remove them, and none of the rods were broken. Which leaves them with either they failed to set up their tent, even though they had distinct and clear memories of setting it up and double checking it was set up because they put gear inside of it, or someone came over to their campsite while they were gone and undid the 4 corners. They decide, you know what, it can't be some stranger coming over here because we're the only ones with the gate combo. This is private property and no one could have been here. And why would they do that if they came to our campsite? Why would they randomly collapse our tent and then vanish? So it had to be us. We must have not made the tent. And while they didn't really believe that they had not made their tent, they convinced themselves that that's what happened because the alternative was just too bizarre and frankly terrifying to consider. So they build their tent and they make a little fire and they stay up for a little while chatting before being tired and saying, okay, let's just go to bed. They extinguish the fire, they get in the tent, and they both fall asleep. A couple hours later, Eben wakes up suddenly and he's not sure if he's dreaming or not, but he thinks he hears someone laughing a couple 100 meters behind their tent off in the woods. Eben instinctively turns to make sure his dad is still in the tent with him, and he is. And then Eben starts listening really intently to what's happening outside. And all he can hear is silence, like it's been since they got in the woods. He doesn't hear any more laughter, and so he says, okay, I must have just been dreaming, and there wasn't any laughter out there, and eventually Eben goes back to sleep. A little while later, Eben wakes up suddenly again, except this time his dad is already awake and looking around anxiously. And Eben sits up and goes, what's going on? And his dad goes, shh, and he goes, can you hear that? And Eben listens, and to his horror, he hears laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Eben also realizes the laughter is not coming from the same area he heard it. It's now coming from the opposite direction, and it's a lot closer to them. Eben very quietly and carefully explains to his dad that he actually heard this laughter a couple hours earlier, and Eben's father turns to Eben and says, before we came out here, I asked the owner, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys. After this revelation, they both turn their attention back to just listening because they're hoping this is just going to stop and whatever this is just going to leave. But it doesn't leave. They hear footsteps running towards them from way off in the forest, and it's so quiet, it's really easy to hear these footsteps. And whatever this is charging towards them, and then it comes to a complete stop right at the edge of their clearing. At this point, Eben is now grabbing onto his father. Eben's father is holding onto his rifle and he's getting ready to open the tent to confront whatever is out there. And right before he grabs the zipper, this person, whatever it is, starts laughing again. And it's practically right on top of them. It's so loud. They can hear it clear as day right there, right outside their tent. And Eben's father takes a deep breath. He grabs the zipper, and as soon as he begins moving it, the sound the zipper made causes the laughter to stop. They don't hear footsteps, so they know probably something's still out there, but the laughter stops like it's recognized that they're making noise. They're right there. There they are. They're in the tent. Eben's father freezes with his hand on this zipper, and he's debating whether he should go outside or not. And before he can even make that decision, whatever this thing is turns around and runs back into the woods, and it's just gone. And for several minutes, they just sit like that in total silence, praying that whatever this is gone for good. And after several minutes, when they don't hear anything, there's no more laughing, there's no more running, Eben's father re-zips up the tent, puts his hand back down, and they're both left just sitting there thinking, what the heck just happened? Eben and his father would stay up all night and they would barely speak because whatever this thing was had heard them when they moved the zipper. And so they were really afraid of making any sound, even little sounds, because it's so quiet, sound travels really far and they don't know who or what is out there. And so in silence, holding their guns, they're just waiting for the sun to come up. And as soon as it did, they were up and out of there, literally running out of the forest, checking over their shoulder the whole time, all the way back to their truck. And so to this day, they have no idea who or what the heck was running around out there. And they told the owner of the property about it. And the owner just said, it's not possible. We have a totally gated in private piece of property and there are cameras watching the only entrance. And you are the only ones that went in or out over that time period. And prior to that, we monitor this property. Nobody else was in there. In the early 1960s, two high school classmates in South Carolina named Carol and Reggie fell in love with each other. Every day in the halls, they'd hold hands and they'd laugh with each other and whisper to each other, and then outside of school, they were inseparable. But despite their seemingly perfect relationship, it didn't last long. They both had different ideas about what the future should hold, and so after graduation, they broke up. Reggie went on to join the US Navy, where he served for a number of years all over the world. He would at one point get married, but that marriage would end quickly, and then after he got out of the military, he got a job at a railroad back at his hometown in South Carolina. As for Carol, after graduation, she got married and divorced too, twice actually, but it was her second failed marriage that nearly killed her. On February 18th, 1987, Carol was living with her 10-year-old daughter Rhonda in South Carolina when her estranged second husband came up to the door and knocked. Carol opened the door and her ex-husband drew a gun and shot her 6 times in front of her daughter before turning around and fleeing. The police would later find his body inside of his car on the side of the road. He had shot himself. As for Carol, the doctors were able to save her life, but the injuries she sustained from the attack were crippling. She was blind in one eye and she had chronic pain, and so her young daughter had to start taking care of her full time. Over the next 8 years, Carol steadily improved and regained some of her independence, but in 1995, she had a huge setback. She started feeling ill, and so she went in to see a doctor, and the doctor did a blood test, and they discovered she had liver cancer. It would turn out the blood that was given to her after the attack that had been transfused into her body to save her life, it had been tainted with hepatitis C. And so she got hepatitis C without realizing it, and because it had been untreated, it led to liver cancer. Rhonda remembers when her mother came home after being given this terrible news, she just sat down and was silent for a minute, and then she just kind of muttered to herself, I just can't get away from this man. He's killing me all over again. But despite being dealt such an unfair hand in life, Carol was determined to not let her injuries or her illness define her. And so she went out looking for a job that could accommodate her physical limitations, and she found it. She was hired as a part-time customer service rep for a television cable company. She was very happy about this job and very proud of it because it was the first time she was working after the attack, and so for once it felt like her life was going back to normal again. A few years later, in 2000, when Carol was working at the cable company, her phone rang and she answered it the way she answered every other call, but the voice she heard on the other end, she immediately recognized. He introduced himself as Reggie Sumner, and so Carol asked him, are you the Reggie Sumner from 1962 at Garrett High School in South Carolina? And he said, yeah, that's me. And Carol said, I'm your ex-girlfriend. We dated in high school. And so it was this incredible reunion, this totally chance phone call. And for the next hour or so, they just chatted on the phone about everything from their kids to their relationships they've been in to what they're up to now. I mean, they had a lot to catch up on since they hadn't seen or heard from each other in nearly 40 years. And so before they hung up, they realized they lived near each other, and so they made plans to get together in person. Rhonda would say her mother, when she came home that night, was like a 16-year-old girl all over again. She talked endlessly about how great Reggie was and how good-looking he was and how excited she was about their upcoming date. And so a couple of days later, Carol and Reggie have this date, and when Carol comes home, Rhonda would say it was obvious her mother had fallen head over heels in love with Reggie all over again. And luckily, Reggie had fallen in love with Carol too, because less than 6 months later, they got married and became Mr. and Mrs. Sumner. Within a year of their marriage, they decided to sell their home in South Carolina and move to Jacksonville, Florida to retire. Even though caring for her mother for all those years had been quite difficult for Rhonda, she said she was very sad to see her mother go, but at the same time, she was really happy for her because it seemed like she had found the one. Over the next couple of years, Rhonda stayed in touch with her mother, speaking to her almost every single day on the phone. But in July of 2005, Rhonda's mother stopped answering her phone. At first, Rhonda wasn't that concerned, but after 24 hours of not hearing from her mother or from Reggie, she did get concerned. Because even though Reggie was able to care for Carol, he wasn't in the best shape himself. He had debilitating diabetes, and he had recently broken his leg, and so was largely confined to a wheelchair. And so if they were to leave their house for an extended period of time, they wouldn't do it without asking for help from Rhonda. And so over the next couple of days, Rhonda incessantly called her mother and called Reggie, but she never got through to them. And so finally, after almost 72 hours of not hearing from them, she decides to just hop in her car and drive the 4 hours to Jacksonville to check on them personally. When she got there, she saw her mother and Reggie's car was not in the driveway like it normally would be. And so Rhonda went up to the front door and she knocked and she's yelling for her mom, but nobody's coming to the door, even though lights are on inside the house. And so Rhonda eventually tries the handle of the door and it's open. And so she opens it up, she steps inside, she yells again for her mom and for Reggie, but no one yells back. And then she sees their beloved dog, Mikey, that they brought everywhere with them, was still in the house. And so she's thinking, where would they have gone without bringing Mikey? And so Rhonda continues to walk through the house into the kitchen. And when she gets there, she sees on the table are 2 plates of food where the food looks like it's a couple of days old and it's just sitting on the plate like they had been eating it and then just abandoned it there. And then in the sink are all these dirty dishes. And then on the stove are half-cooked pots of food. And Rhonda knows her mother is an extremely tidy person and she never would have left her house with dirty dishes and food out on the table. And so red flags are going up for Rhonda. But what ultimately sealed the deal for her was when she turned and looked on one of the counters, she saw the cell phone that Reggie and Carol shared was still sitting there along with Carol's purse. And then next to that was both of their medications, which was Reggie's insulin and Carol's liver cancer medication, both of which were life-saving and needed to be taken every single day. There's no way they would have left the house without those things. And so Rhonda immediately calls the Jacksonville Police Department and she files a missing person report. And before long, the missing couple's story is all over the news and all of the networks are asking people if they have information to come forward, but no one came forward. And so the only lead the police had was to track down the Sumner's car, which was missing from their driveway when Rhonda showed up at their house. So the police shared the description of their vehicle all across the state, and very quickly they got a hit. The car had been found abandoned in a Florida town about 1 hour west of Jacksonville. It had been parked in this semi-forested, very secluded area off of a dirt road, and there was nothing inside of it, but they saw the battery had been taken out, leading some of the officers to speculate that perhaps the Sumners really had just driven away from their home without telling anybody and then ran into car troubles. But that theory would quickly be thrown out the window when 5 hours later, the Jacksonville police received a very strange phone call. The man who called in said he was Reggie Sumner, and he said he had seen the news about him and his wife being missing and that was just totally not true, that in reality they had left, but they were just fine and they'd be back soon. The police are immediately suspicious of this person. They don't think it's Reggie Sumner because, for one, he sounds like a young man and Reggie is a 61-year-old. And so the voice didn't really line up. And just the way he was talking about this disappearance like it was no big deal, that also just didn't really make sense. And so one of the officers asked Reggie, "Are you with your wife, Carol?" And he said, "Yep, I'm with her. Here she is." And so a woman hops on the phone who says she's Carol Sumner, but she sounds far too young to be Carol Sumner, who's 61. This sounds like a 18, 19, 20-year-old girl. And she too just reiterates that everything's just fine and they've gone out for a couple of days. There's nothing to worry about. And, you police can stop looking for us. And so after this call ends, the police at this point are convinced that this simply cannot be Carol and Reggie. But to make sure, they call in Rhonda and they have her listen to the recording of this conversation with the so-called Reggie and Carol. And right away, Rhonda says, "That's not my mom and that's not Reggie." And so at this point, the police assumed that these two people who called in pretending to be the Sumners probably had something to do with the disappearance of the real Sumners. And so while they waited for the trace on this phone call to come back, which would give them information about who was calling and from where, the police decided to investigate another angle. The police looked at the Sumners' bank statements and they saw their bank card had been used at an ATM in South Carolina after the Sumners had been reported missing. And so they called that bank and they asked for the CCTV footage from that ATM. And when they watched it, they saw that it was not Carol or Reggie Sumner withdrawing funds. It was some unknown man in his early 20s. Right after this discovery of this unknown man, the trace from the phone conversation with the imposter Sumners came back, except it was tied to a fake name at a fake address. So that wasn't helpful to the police in their investigation. However, when they went through this cell phone's call logs, which they got with the phone trace, they saw whoever owned the cell phone had recently placed a call to a car rental company in South Carolina. And so the police call this car rental company and they speak to the manager and they're able to figure out that somebody using this cell phone number had indeed called and had rented a car, and the car they rented matched the description of the car the unknown man was driving in the ATM surveillance footage. But this car had been rented to a woman. Her name was Tiffany Cole. The rental company told police that all of their cars had satellite tracking information built into them. And so police were able to use that information to track Tiffany's rental car to a motel in South Carolina. The initial thought was that maybe the Sumners are being held against their will in this motel. And so very quickly, a police force was organized, and on the morning of July 14th, so 6 days after the Sumners were listed as missing, they arrive at this motel, they go to the front desk, they find out what room Tiffany is in, they get the key, and they go up and they open the door. The Sumners were not inside. Instead, there were 3 young adults sitting there. It was 24-year-old Tiffany Cole, her boyfriend, 23-year-old Michael James Jackson, and his friend, 19-year-old Alan Wade. Also in the room were dozens of bags of recently purchased merchandise, like computers and video games and clothes and perfume, and also they discovered the key to the Sumners' vehicle and Reggie Sumner's prized coin collection. The police brought all 3 back to the police station and put them in separate rooms to be interrogated. At this point, it was obvious to police that these 3 had something to do with the Sumners' disappearance. They had all these things in the room that tied them to the missing couple. And so now the police, as they interrogated them, it was not so much about connecting them to the Sumners as much as it was about helping them find the Sumners. At first, all 3 of them either didn't talk or were totally uncooperative. But under intense questioning, Tiffany cracked a little bit. She said that they had robbed the Sumners, but nothing more. They didn't do anything else besides rob them. And there had been a 4th person involved in the robbery, 19-year-old Bruce Nixon, who was friends with Alan Wade. Bruce lived nearby, so the police quickly rounded him up and brought him in for questioning, and unlike the other 3, Bruce immediately caved. And the story he told about what happened to the Sumners brought many of the police that were involved in this investigation to tears. He said it all started with Tiffany. Tiffany used to be neighbors with the Sumners back when they still lived in South Carolina. Tiffany had a pretty rough upbringing and her father was permanently sick. And so the Sumners kind of took her under their wing and looked after her and built a very close relationship with her and kind of treated her like she was one of their daughters. Anything she needed, if she needed money, food, anything, they would give it to her. For example, in 2001, right before they left for Florida, they sold a car to Tiffany, but they sold it for basically nothing because they knew she didn't have any money and she really needed a car. 4 years later, in June of 2005, Tiffany was partying in Jacksonville, Florida with her new boyfriend, Michael James Jackson, when they got kicked out of the house they planned on staying in for the night. And so now they don't have a place to stay, they don't have any money, and that's when Tiffany remembers the Sumners had moved to Jacksonville and they would always help her out if she needed anything. And so the 2 of them drive to the Sumners' house in the middle of the night, they haven't called them, and they just knock on the door, totally uninvited, and Carol comes to the door, and when she opens it, she sees Tiffany, and immediately she's like, "Oh my goodness, I haven't seen you in so long. Come in, come in. Who are you? Oh, Michael, great to meet you. Come on inside. I'll get you food. We'll get you fed. What do you need? What can we do for you?" And so that's when Tiffany explains to them that their plans had kind of fallen through and they didn't have a place to stay that night, and would it be possible to stay with them? And so Carol and Reggie right away say, "Absolutely no problem. Tiffany, Michael, you guys are guests here. You're welcome. Stay as long as you want." And so that night, Carol cooked a big meal for them and they all sat down at the table. And at some point, Carol and Reggie talk about the sale of their house in South Carolina, and somehow it came up that they had made $99,000 in profit from this sale, and they were so happy about it because now they could really retire comfortably. And so as soon as they said that, Tiffany and Michael shot glances at each other because they knew they had to come back and rob them. The next morning, Carol and Reggie got up early, they made coffee and they made breakfast, and they were hoping that Tiffany and Michael would stick around for the day and spend some more time with them. But Tiffany and Michael were very quick to want to leave. They said, "Thank you very much, we got to hit the road." And so they left. And as soon as they get in the car, they start planning how they're going to come back and rob the Sumners and get their hands on that $99,000. 1 month later, on the evening of July 8th, after all robbery preparations have been made, Bruce Nixon and Alan Wade show up at the Sumner house and they knock on the door. When the door opens, it's Carol, and she doesn't recognize either of them, but being as kind and generous as she was, she said, "Hey boys, what can I do for you? How can I help you?" And this was exactly what Bruce and Alan were expecting based on what Tiffany told them. She said this couple would be very easy to exploit. And they tell her that their car had broken down and they needed to use her phone. And so she's a little bit skeptical, but ultimately she says, "Sure, come on in." And so Bruce and Alan go inside the house, the door shuts behind them, and as soon as it does, one of them draws a fake gun that looks very real and pointed it at Carol, while the other one began tying her up with cord and with duct tape. And so Carol begins screaming and making a bunch of noise, and Reggie, who's in the garage out of sight, he hears her. He comes running in to see what's going on, and he sees these two men who immediately attack him, and Reggie's got a broken leg and he's already pretty weak and frail, and so he doesn't put up much of a fight. And before long, he and his wife were all taped up and restrained on the couch, and they were having duct tape wrapped around their heads until everything was covered except for a slit underneath their nose so they could breathe. And so with the couple completely under control and at the mercy of their captors, one of the men texted Michael, who was down the road with Tiffany inside of Tiffany's rental car, and the text just said, "All clear." And what that meant was Michael could now come up and help them rob the house. And so Tiffany stays down the road in the rental car. Michael makes his way up. He goes inside, and he, Bruce, and Alan proceeded to ransack the house. And while these three men are moving room to room, taking all of their valuables, Reggie and Carol are probably thinking to themselves that, you know what, this is awful, we're getting robbed, but after they take whatever they take and they leave, we'll be fine, we'll recover. But when these three men finished taking all of their valuable items, they decided that they would also take Reggie and Carol. So they stood the couple up and they marched them into the garage and they put them in the trunk of their own car. At this point, Bruce left the Sumner's house and went down the road and got in Tiffany's rental car, and Michael and Alan, they got into the Sumner's car, and the two cars met up on the road and then drove 40 minutes northwest just over the border into Georgia, where they found this access road and they went down it until they reached this very secluded section of forest. This was not just some random spot in the middle of the woods in Georgia. This was a pre-selected spot that Tiffany and the others had been out to 2 days earlier to prepare it. And what they had done to prepare was to dig a grave for the Sumners. Michael and Alan, in the Sumners car, drove up right next to the grave site, while Tiffany and Bruce came up right behind them. And once they had all stopped, they got out of the car and they went right behind the Sumners car and they popped open the trunk. It's believed the temperature inside of that trunk was well over 100 degrees. And so Reggie and Carol were sweating profusely, and the sweat had caused their restraints to slip off their wrists and slip down off their face. And so the two of them were found holding on to each other and crying and praying. Seeing how weak they already were, the group decided they did not need to put new tape around their wrists or their face. They weren't going to go anywhere. And so they grabbed the two and they pulled them out and dumped them on the ground. It was probably around this time that the Sumners realized Tiffany was one of these four people that was doing this horrible thing to them. And I can only imagine the heartbreak they experienced. This girl that they took in under their wing, that they thought of as a daughter, was betraying them in such a heinous and horrible way. But there was no time to feel upset about it, because as soon as they were dumped on the ground, Michael grabbed Reggie and kind of threw him over to the side and said, "Sit down, don't move, or I'm going to kill you and your wife." And then the others grabbed Carol and dragged her away from her husband over to the edge of the grave, where they literally ripped the jewelry off of her face and off of her body. And then after all the jewelry was gone, they pushed her into the grave. Then they walked over to Reggie and dragged him over and threw him in with his wife. As soon as the couple was in the grave together, they repositioned themselves so they were both sitting up, one in front of the other, with Carol behind Reggie, and she threw her legs and her arms around Reggie, just kind of clutching onto him, and she buried her head into his back and she began crying. The original plan, apparently, had been to take the Sumners and put them in this grave and pretend like you were going to do something to them to scare them into giving up all of their information, all of their banking information, and anything else that was valuable. And it worked. And so as Carol is crying into Reggie's back, Reggie is pleading with the group. He's pleading to them, let me give you everything I have. Whatever you need, it's yours. And so Michael said, give me all your ATM bank card numbers, give me your PIN numbers, everything. And so Reggie did. He gave him all the information he could possibly give to him. And then, for some reason, despite the fact that at this point, the group has taken everything of value from this poor couple. They have extracted all the valuable information they could possibly get from them. Despite that, they decide that that's not enough. They need to kill the Sumners. And they need to kill them in the worst way imaginable. They need to bury them alive. For hours, the group slowly, shovelful by shovelful, filled in this hole with Reggie and Carol sitting at the bottom begging for their lives. But the group didn't care at all. They just kept shoveling dirt down on top of them until the dirt and mud had gotten up to their necks and the weight of the dirt was pressing in on their chests and was making it really hard to breathe. And so as Carol and Reggie are feeling this happening to them, they can feel themselves being crushed under this weight. Their cries for help become more and more desperate, but more spaced apart because their breathing at this point is so labored. It's so hard to get a full breath that they're conserving their air at this point. And then at some point, as the dirt crept closer and closer to their mouths, they had to tilt their heads up to try to get a good breath of air. But when they did that, they began shoveling dirt directly onto their faces, causing them to choke and gag. They're inhaling this, and it's becoming nearly impossible to catch a breath. They're dying at this point. And so finally, another layer of dirt was thrown on top of them and they disappeared under the soil. But their sounds didn't go away. They continued to whimper and make sounds as more and more dirt was put down until finally they had filled in the hole and they began packing the dirt down with the backs of their shovels. And they could hear underneath the soil still the sounds of this couple dying. This was a slow and horrible death. After the killers were done, they left the site and they took the Sumner's car and they dumped it in Florida where it was ultimately found. And then they all piled into the rental car. They went to an ATM and pulled some of the Sumner's money out and then went on a spending spree. Here is a photo of Tiffany celebrating just hours after killing the very people that had taken her in and treated her like a daughter. After their autopsies, the medical examiner explained that both Reggie and Carol had dirt packed into their nose, into their mouths, in their throats, in their stomach, and in their lungs, meaning their actual cause of death was being buried alive. In exchange for telling investigators what happened and for leading them to the gravesite where the Sumners were, Bruce Nixon was spared the death penalty and given a life sentence. As for Michael, Allen, and Tiffany, they were all sentenced to death. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go into the like button's favorite music playlist and replace all of the songs with the Kids Bop versions of them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.